Hello again. I've been playing some more Biotech, but since finishing up with Sanguinius and friends, I've installed a few mods. Okay, a lot of mods. I've gone back to something close to my mod list from before Biotech, which means every vanilla expanded mod that's been updated, combat extended, and a few other things. For the colony we'll be talking about today, I installed an interesting mod that allows me to clone a colonist, copying their genes exactly into an embryo that can then be grown into a vat. The mod comes with a scenario that starts you off with a single colonist and the required technology and materials to start some cloning. So naturally we'll be playing that. I set the storyteller to Cass on Blood and Dust, which should give a nice balance of difficulty while still actually letting me progress when starting with a single colonist. So I created an ideology that I think will fit the colony well, the genetic union. Their gestalt, which means they sort of share a mood. If the majority of the colony is happy, then they get a mood buff and vice versa. Alongside that, they're traders and fleshcrafters, which I had hoped would go together better, but unfortunately it turns out no one will buy fleshcrafted body parts. Still, the trader precept is a very handy one, allowing you to have a constant flow of caravans to the colony, which help with both commerce and defense. We're settling on a southern coastline, just west of Horse's Achievement C, in an area of flat terrain. I've been making too many mountain colonies of late, so I think it'll be nice to play on some flatter ground for a change. As for our single colonist, well, that would be Greg. I created a xenotype for him named Clone Origin, which grants elongated fingers, pretty, reduced pain, and sanguine, for the drawbacks of cold weakness, tinder skin, and being sterile. Which, to be fair, is kind of a free one since, cloning. Greg himself is a 10 across the board, with passions in shooting, construction, cooking, and medical. I actually thought that when I cloned Greg, his progeny would inherit these skills, but I was wrong about that. So this isn't as OP a colony as I thought it was going to be back when I created the progenitor Greg. So I know I've said this a lot lately, but this one really will have a slow start, since Greg is all alone and will have to wait for his clones to grow. But first things first, I built a small wooden shack for all of this to take place in. I'd need to get some good steady power generation as soon as possible to support growth vats, so since we've got a river here, I started researching water mills. For now though, a wood fueled generator would do. With the place powered up, I extracted Greg's gene seed and threw it into a growth vat, at which point I learned the story of the hungry homunculus. It turns out that massively accelerating human growth requires quite a lot of nutrition, so I planted some farms and settled in for a lot of cooking. When the first embryo was born, I named it Greg II, and I also got to name the settlement, which I called the Vat Fields, and the faction Genogenesis. I finished researching watermills around this point too, so I could move on from the simple wood-fired generator. Also around this point, I ticked over 5,000 subscribers on the channel. Wow. I can't thank you all. That sounded very sarcastic, but I'm serious. I can't thank you all enough for the support. It's extremely motivating to see the numbers get bigger like that, and all of your comments have been very kind. And if you're not subscribed, well, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. Your mother and I expected more from you. Anyway, the first hostile event was a pack of man-hunting foxes, which Greg fought off most valiantly. And to celebrate his victory, he got back into the gene extractor and had his seed collected once more. It takes a long time to incubate someone to adulthood, so having a couple on the go simultaneously seems like a good idea. Of course, it would mean I'd need to make even more food though. And I realized here that growing pawns all the way to adulthood in a growth vat is a really good way to create some absolutely awful colonists with no passions, very few skill levels, and no choice of traits, just one randomly gained at each growth moment. But I decided that it's not really in the spirit of a cloning facility to have children running around, and committed to growing every iteration of Greg all the way to adulthood in the growth vats. For quite a while here, the game was simply managing Greg every day to try and keep a steady output of meals for the vats, which at this point meant a mix of hunting and growing. And Greg wasn't particularly happy with this arrangement, and it meant that no research was getting done, which is a bigger deal than it sounds like thanks to Combat Extended. In order to produce any ammo, I needed to at least research through to machining to make a loading bench, but I couldn't really address that now, so let's just get Greg a little bit happier instead. I built a very small and basic temple and gave progenitor Greg the role of manager of total unity, which is the moral guide. and just in time for Greg II to grow to adulthood. Through his vat-bound childhood, he picked up Night Owl, Teetotaler, and Groundbreaker, which is a pretty good one. However, not as good as it would usually be, because it turns out that when a colonist gains a trait that confers skill bonuses in this way, they don't actually get them. So instead, in this case, Groundbreaker just gives the percent boosts to construction and mining ability, instead of the +4 skill levels it would also usually grant. But at least it's not a negative trait. Before I could get Greg II armed, a group of tribals from Westwood came to break some stuff. For some reason, they were much more interested in setting fires and smashing the place up than killing Gregs, which meant that I could just about fight them off. Cutting forwards a bit, we've built the base out somewhat, giving Greg II his own bedroom and making space for a little workshop later on. Then, after granting Greg II the role of Fleshcrafter, we beat a pig who crashed in a drop pod to death and stole some of his body parts before fighting off another raid. Now it's about time that progenitor Greg gets his own room, and now's when some stuff starts to go into the workshop area too. And Greg III becomes an adult and gains the tough trait, earning him his place as the colony's first melee fighter. And so that Greg can spend more time putting his comparatively high skills to work, Greg III will spend the vast majority of his time sat in front of the research bench. A slow process at first, but as I'm sure you know, Intellectual is by far the fastest skill to level in Rimworld, and before you know it, a brainless clone will grow to be a savant-level researcher. And here's another Greg, the fourth this time. I hope you're recognizing the naming pattern by now. It's pretty complex, I know. The cloning mod features random mutations, which are configurable in the mod options, and I've just left them at the default settings. But poor Greg IV has picked up nearsightedness and a case of cell instability. So while Greg III is a melee fighter because he's tough, Greg IV is a melee fighter because he can't see the distance so good. It's different paths to the same end result. Something journey destination, I don't know. The Gregs had an unforgettable party and then beat another space refugee down to their component parts. And then in a moment of extreme good fortune, I was just looking at these cool weapons that I couldn't afford from a war merchant, when a pair of man-hunting polar bears wandered in and bashed in the skull of one of the caravan's muffalo, spilling the shiny futuristic swords onto the ground. The merchants decided this wasn't worth the trouble and just left without them. So thanks, polar bears, you won't be forgotten. Okay, so I dramatized the events a little bit. The bears didn't actually bash in the muffalo's skull. They just injured it enough that when I looked away, it fell over. Along with the swords, it also dropped 31 of these 155 mil EMP shells, which turned out to be worth about 12,000 silver in total. This is a top-shelf Rimworld moment, to be brought down for special occasions and good company. A completely negative event netting the colony a pair of top-tier weapons and 12,000 silver. Now it's time to make a nicer dining and recreation room, because the place is a little bit utilitarian right now. Having the trader ideology raises everyone's expectation levels, and then bestowing them roles raises them even further, which is pretty rough early game, since it means to stave off boredom they need 6 different types of recreation available. And with that in mind, I researched modern furniture so that they could have a standing piano, and I also bought a sick flat screen. Another more useful feature of the traders is that they can perform a ritual to attract caravans to the colony, so we did that. It wasn't great and only attracted a single caravan, which someone holding the trader role can do just about every day anyway, but whatever, the reason I'm bringing it up is because it attracted a slaver who had some worrying merchandise. They're selling an Itakin child who belongs to an ideology named Furry Pack, which has an icon of Tzeentch for its symbol. And that's pretty rough, but to be fair, it could be worse. It could be Slaanesh. Then another child showed up, as a wanderer this time, asking nicely if they could join the colony. They're named Grumps, which is almost Greg, sort of, but not close enough, so they were sent away. At this point I decided we had survived off the back of luck for long enough and made some turrets. These military turrets with 2 guns are crazy powerful in combat extended, as I discovered in my Winston Wave video, so I made 2 little emplacements of those for now. Real defences would have to come later. We don't really have the workforce to put up proper walls and everything for now. Another slaver came by, in space this time, and I decided to buy this nice young lady called Lou, for her cooking ability. Nothing else. I know, funny sex slave joke, but seriously, with her cooking and helping out in the fields, that freed up a lot more time for Greg to do other things that the clones couldn't do so good, like crafting. and Greg IV, in all his instability, managed to reach adulthood, gaining eccentric, ecologist, and desensitized along the way, which are all pretty good, but just to reiterate, the skill bonuses from ecologist aren't applied here, only the percentage buffs. And I'd like to know what he saw in his growth vat dreams of being a weirdo ecologist that desensitized him to everything, but we'll never know. He was sleeping on the floor for a moment here, so I quickly built another bedroom for him, mirroring the shape of Greg III's room here, which is a strange looking room, but in architecture, just like jazz, repetition legitimizes, repetition legitimizes, repetition legitimizes. And then something a little bit weird happened. Something that's bound to happen occasionally when you have equipment mods going. A trader spawned and I spent a while looking for the actual trader person, only to find them incapacitated over where they had spawned. The cause is their gas mask, which I think is from Vanilla Apparel Expanded. It provides protection from, well, things you'd wear a gas mask for, with the drawback of reducing the colonists' breathing efficiency. Fair enough. Breathing through heavy-duty respirators sucks. The end result is that this poor old lady with basically every old person debuff in the game spawned with a gas mask on, and it pushed her consciousness low enough to make her vegetative. So anyway, there she is on the floor, not allowing me to trade with them, so I figured I'd help out and rescue her. The problem is that to ever get rid of her again, I have to strip her to get rid of the mask, which angers the faction. But now I can trade with them, and there's nothing here for me, but at least I get some of the goodwill back when they leave. And oh boy, look at this, there's drop pods everywhere. Another great opportunity to demonstrate the extreme power of shotguns in Combat Extended. And with the little help from the turrets, they were dealt with pretty easily. I keep having to turn wanderers away to preserve the Gregginess of the colony. It really hurts when I have all of these useless Gregs that I could be turning away incredible colonists, but the simple fact of the matter is they're not Greg, so they can't join. Alrighty, a couple more fighty things happened here. Firstly, there'd been this worm hanging around the colony for a while and I hadn't seen it eat anything, so I decided it was smart to kill it before it ate someone. Then, in some kind of reptilian brotherhood revenge plot, an absolute horde of blind salamanders, ohms I guess, descended upon us. They're small and squishy, so it looked a lot worse than it was. But that was followed shortly by a tribal raid, which are also quite squishy, so still no big deal. I had a quest come in for a neuroformer. All I had to do was deal with a climate adjuster. And I wanted to make progenitor Greg a psychic, so I sent him and Greg II to go deal with it. Which wasn't hard, aside from this single turret that was there. Greg got the Warlord tree as his first, which is great, but I feel like with Vanilla Psycasts Expanded, in order to level a Psycaster quickly, it's best to have something like this skill in the Technomancer tree, which allows you to increase the quality of an item by 1 level. I like this because it's completely spammable. The reason it's important to me is that in Vanilla Psycasts Expanded, your casters level by meditating to gain psi juice, so you want to be able to constantly spend their psi juice to race through the first few levels nice and quick. However, at this point things started to go a little bit not so well. I could just feel that the colony was lagging behind the level of threats that were now being thrown at it. But we kept plugging along, fending off the inhabitants of an infested chunk and then a raid of armoured kingdom folk. I accepted a small construction quest since it rewarded a pair of tech prints, one of which was for brain wiring, which would be pretty essential for pain stoppers, as flesh crafting comes with the scarification precept for some reason, which is a real, well, pain without pain stoppers. I finally started to plan a big outer wall here, but if I'm being honest, this isn't really quite how you do it with this many mods. If you look at the threats that come upon the colony from here, you'll notice that not many of them spawn from the map edges. But that doesn't really matter because the wall isn't built anyway. Just planned. A couple of things happened here that weren't recorded, because it turns out that if you open Netflix whilst recording with Shadowplay, it will just stop your recording without a notification. I just wanted to check whether All Quiet on the Western Front was out yet. I didn't even watch it. What you missed was progenitor Greg starting to write skill books for his progeny so that they could start to be less useless. And Greg V growing to adulthood with the traits Trigger Happy, Academian and Dog Person. Also, he annoyingly picked up Loose Angler ideologies, so I just kept throwing him back in the growth vat between convert cooldowns until all that was sorted. And there was a pretty cool Toxfolk drop pod raid that had us all fighting in the hallways. It was great, and then I realised it wasn't recorded and that made me sad, so I stopped for the day. The next morning, things started to go from bad to very bad. For some reason, the place started to get very sickly all of a sudden. A few of the Gregs were hit with plague, which got really close to killing Greg the Fifth for some reason. Probably didn't help that we weren't actually manufacturing medicine yet, but there was a decent supply of Glitterworld meds. I'm always kind of stingy with those though, so they weren't being used. A pack of manhunting wargs came and had a go at the turrets, but they were dealt with quite nicely. Most soft targets can be dealt with pretty easily by the turrets in Combat Extended. Sieges aren't quite so simple though. A gang of pigs showed up and had to be drawn from their cover by Greg the Fifth with his makeshift LMG, which took a really long time, but we got them to come attack eventually and just about dealt with them. And then a few more infested chunks landed. I tend to dread these particular events as their brutality is so varying. This time it went pretty okay, and to be fair, the reward is a good chunk of steel and components, so that's fine, I guess. I had set up a hydroponics room at this point, and put it to work producing cotton and dyes. Clearly I've got my priorities straight here. I should really be focusing on defences and the colony's medical capabilities, but oh well. At least I can start to paint the walls a nice shade of Viridian. Greg had gained a few Psilink levels by this point and had just unlocked the ability to create steel constructs, which are essentially just animated slag chunks to stand in front of enemies for you. They're pretty mediocre and a bit of a pain to manage when compared to the new Mechaniter stuff. They don't have their own fancy UI and just have to be drafted whenever you need them, rather than being able to escort their creator at all times. Anyway, an infested ship module crashed here, which, as you might expect, is much the same concept as the infested chunks, but bigger bugs come out. I got pretty worried when I saw this big girl and her megapede pop out, but it was actually fine. Again, military turrets are real good, lots of bullets. A couple of larger targets aren't the problem. It's when there's a horde of unsuppressible targets that these turrets get overwhelmed. Ominous foreshadowing. I mentioned that the place got very ill all of a sudden today, and here's some more of that. First came the malaria, then the flu, and then the alpacas, which aren't a disease, but still, alpacas. I figured it was best to have a party to cheer everybody up. Given that there's malaria, plague, and the flu running rampant, this probably isn't technically the best idea, but Rimworld isn't actually modelling super spreader events, so it's probably fine. And Lou decided now was a good time to make a run for it, so Greg III cut off her arm. It's always kind of a neat idea to have blunt weapons on hand for this kind of scenario, but in the heat of the moment, you know how it is. You just start chopping and hope for the best. It would have been nice to attach one of the flesh-crafted arms I had here, but for some reason that wasn't an option. I only seemed to be able to replace an existing part with a flesh-crafted one, rather than put one into a void left by the original, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that's the intended behaviour, but it doesn't seem like it. I never once actually made use of the flesh-crafting precept of this ideology, other than for funny war crime content anyway. Like when this transport pod crashed and I rescued the inhabitants since they were actually from a local faction. But then I accidentally let them starve to death, and then harvested them for parts that I would never use. Anyway, half of that exterior wall that I planned earlier is built now, which is cool, but a limestone wall can't stop malaria, which made its second appearance right about now. Poor Greg IV has managed to catch every single one of these illnesses, by the way, and for his hardship he gained the super immune trait, which is the only time I've ever had one of these events that feels reasonable. The guy is just a walking biological weapon by now. And this is the perfect time for a fairly large bandit raid. I was really feeling like I was behind the difficulty curve at this point. Just not getting enough done in terms of research, arms and armour production, or population. But we managed to hold off those rootin' tootin' fellers just in time for Greg VI to come out of her vat. Yeah, her. I'm not sure how that happened, but Greg VI is a lady. Fair enough. It makes no difference to me. She's got the traits Industrious, Wimp, and Mad Surgeon. Mad Surgeon and Industrious are pretty great, though training medical from zero is a pretty Herculean task that involves a lot of organ harvesting, and probably a book by Progenitor Greg. And it feels like at this point the downward spiral sort of just drops away and is replaced by a freefall. A massive pack of Manhunter Wolfhounds show up. And remember when I was talking about how great these military turrets are, except for against hordes of things? Well, sure enough, the two turrets were no match for the Bloodhound gang, and I put up a sort of half-hearted defense, which actually did much better than I thought, but it didn't go too well for Greg II, who effectively got his head bitten off. The message in the log actually reads, missing a neck caused Greg II to die, which I can't fault for accuracy, but it's not a particularly sympathetic way of putting it. So the Gregs made him a sarcophagus of jade and had a funeral for him. Greg II was the colony's premier miner and builder, having long since overtaken progenitor Greg in both aspects. So losing him was really going to suck, but isn't necessarily a death sentence for the colony. However, it didn't help things when a little while later, shortly after fitting a prosthetic arm to her, Lou decided to try and run away again. This time, Greg IV decided to just behead her. She's not gonna run away again, so I guess from a certain perspective it makes sense. But now that leaves us without a full-time cook. And sure, OG Greg can slot back into that role, but then who's gonna build? You can tell by now that things are slipping away from me, going from bad to worse. And in something of a portentous vision of the future, a gang of poor orphans were savaged to death by another hungry worm. I'm not sure why there's so many of those hanging around here, but they're properly deadly. And oh look, here's the coffin nail flying in from space, in the form of yet more infested chunks. They landed and immediately the bugs spilled out and started to attack. I think because they landed on a section of wall, but I'm not totally sure. In any case, I wasn't prepared at all, and they quickly got into stabbing range and murdered everybody but Greg IV, who could now do nothing but destroy the evidence that this whole thing ever even happened. It's probably best if the world at large forgets of the Greg experiment, allowing them to fade into obscurity as a myth. A cautionary tale against trying to run a colony on entirely vat-grown colonists. In his final moments, he stands at the piano and plays a short tune before finally giving in to smoke inhalation. So there it is. Biotech is still very good fun, but I really can't recommend you try a colony like this. Growth vats are seriously underpowered in their current state, and I'd love it if there were some archotech improvements for them, allowing vat-grown colonists to either develop properly or much more quickly. And I'm sure this is something I'll be able to retry with mods once they've had a little longer to melt properly into the biotech stew, as currently for the most part they just feel compatible rather than properly tuned. I hope you enjoyed watching a failed colony for a change too. It's important to remember that it's not all roaring successes. For every colony you see, there's usually at least one heartbreaker that made it just far enough to have me really invested before falling apart. Whatever you do though, please remain indoors. There's a suspiciously high number of worms out there. No, not worms. Worms. With wings. Teeth. Until next time, thanks for watching. Goodbye.